Today we examine one of Mikhail Tal's most picturesque combinations. Geometrically so beautiful, it looks almost divine, with every piece placed perfectly to illustrate one of the most epic pinning ideas in chess history. So let's dive into this fascinating game and uncover the hidden geometry of chess together with Mikhail Tal. Tal starts with knight f3 and his opponent Brinck-Claussen replies with knight f6. After c4, c5, knight c3, knight c6, e3, e6, d4 and d5, the game has transposed into the queen's gambit, where black plays the Tarrasch defense, attacking the d4 pawn. Probably white's most common reply is c takes d, and after black recaptures he usually gets a position with an isolated d5 pawn, but Tal doesn't play it, he doesn't capture on d5. Instead, he repeats the moves from the game we examined last week, the game that was played 10 years ago against Polugaevsky. In that game, Tal was playing the black pieces, and Polugaevsky didn't capture on d5. Instead, as he wrote in his annotations, he liked playing positions with an isolated pawn himself. So, instead of creating an isolated pawn in his opponent's position by capturing on d5, Polugaevsky waited for Tal to capture on d4. And Tal does, now Tal is playing the white pieces, Tal does the same. He plays like Polugaevsky. He plays a3. And this move actually has a point. If black makes the most natural developing move bishop e7, white is going to capture on c5, forcing his opponent to lose a tempo. Black would be forced to move the already developed bishop one more time by capturing on c5, and now we can see the idea behind a3. White would push the b pawn forward with a tempo, grabbing space on the queen side and vacating the b2 square for his bishop, and after the black bishop retreats, white fianchettos his bishop, getting an active piece play and a slight advantage. For this reason, black doesn't develop the bishop. First, he captures on d4, just like Tal did in that game, and only after white recaptures, now black develops the bishop without losing a tempo. The engine says that white's strongest move is c5, avoiding the emergence of the isolated pawn, also avoiding the loss of a tempo and getting the pawn majority on the queen side, 3 pawns against the 2 pawns. But as I already said, Tal is playing like Polugaevsky. He, instead of pushing the pawn forward, is waiting for his opponent to capture on c4. So Tal develops the bishop, letting his opponent capture on c4, and indeed that would be black's best move, but he castles, letting Tal push the pawn forward to c5, which again would be his strongest move, but Tal avoids it, avoids this variation, he castles, and only now black captures, and white loses a tempo. He must move the bishop one more time, and he also gets a weak isolated pawn. This pawn is weak because white doesn't have pawns on the c or the e files to defend the pawn, so the white pieces will be tied to the defense of this pawn. Black also gets a great blockading d5 square for his pieces, but the d4 pawn, the isolated pawn, also has its strength. It controls the important central squares, restricting black. Thanks to this pawn, white gets the space advantage and the possibility of creating an active piece play and maybe even initiating an attack. So, one of black's main problems is the bad light squared bishop, which is restricted by the e6 pawn. So, just like Tal did 10 years ago, black, Brinck-Claussen, plays b6. He is going to fianchetto the bishop, and the bishop will be greatly placed on the long diagonal. Queen d3, developing the queen and vacating the d1 square for the rook, and the rook will defend the isolated pawn and support its possible advance to d5. If white succeeds in executing this thematic breakthrough in the right time, he will definitely seize the initiative. Bishop b7 follows, rook d1, rook c8. Putting pressure on the bishop, which is unpleasant, so just like Polugaevsky did 10 years ago, Tal retreats the bishop to a2, to the ideal square, on which the bishop is absolutely safe. It still controls the important d5 square, and if needed, from a2 the bishop can move to b1, and on this diagonal, together with the queen, it can create serious threats to the black king. h7 might fall under attack. Queen c7 follows, vacating the d8 square for the rook to put more pressure on the isolated pawn. bishop g5, developing the bishop, vacating the c1 square for the rook, and putting pressure on the knight, which plays a very important role. It controls the vital d5 square. Rook d8 follows, not only attacking the pawn, putting pressure on the pawn, but also creating an unpleasant x-ray. So, as the white queen is on the d-file, he cannot push the pawn forward. So, Tal moves the queen away from the d-file, and now he is ready to push the pawn forward, seizing the initiative. So, black must do something about this threat. So, in that game, and now we come to the point when black will make a different move from the game that was played 10 years ago. In that game, Tal, playing black pieces, made a sharp move, knight g4. So if you didn't see that fantastic game last week, I will place the link at the end of this video. So by playing knight g4, Tal creates terrible threats. So the knight together created in that game terrible threat. The knight together with the queen attacked the h2 pawn, and the only defender of the pawn is the knight, f3 knight. So black is threatening to capture on d4, attacking the queen, attacking the knight, opening the bishop's diagonal, which will also join the attack. So after if black succeeds in executing his threat by capturing on d4, the white knight won't be able to capture, of course, because the queen would capture on h2, followed by checkmate in 1. So the second threat was bishop takes g5, and again, as we know, this knight cannot move, white cannot recapture because h2 would fall. But Polugayevsky in his turn, instead of defending against these threats, played knight b5, creating his own threats, attacking the black queen and defending the pawn, and that led to fantastic complications and eventual queen sacrifice by Polugayevsky, and after this fantastic queen sacrifice he outcalculated Tal, and that game was fantastic. You can watch it later. But let's return to our game. In our game, instead of knight g4, like Tal played 10 years ago, Brinck-Claussen makes a move that, as Tal writes 10 years ago, he didn't even consider. Of course, he saw that move, but he didn't even consider it seriously. Let's see why. So, white is threatening d5. So what can be more natural than blockading the pawn with the best blockader, the knight? So knight d5 was played in our game instead of knight g4. And let's see why Tal refrained from making that move 10 years ago. So at the moment, as you see, the bishop is very strong. It puts pressure on the long diagonal. The rook is very strong. It is putting pressure on white's main weakness, on the d4 pawn. But after black played knight d5, white simply captures on d5. And black cannot capture with the rook because the bishop controls this square, so he's forced to capture with the pawn. And now, although black's position is solid, it's quite passive. The pawn is blocking the bishop. The light-squared bishop has turned into a bad bishop again. The rook's file is also closed, so the rook is also passive. So it's difficult for black to create some counter chances. And all he can do is just passively defend this position. So let's see what Tal plays. He, as his queen on the e-file will sooner or later fall under attack, he moves the queen away from the open file, also eyeing the h7 pawn. The engine says that black can equalize by simplifying the position, by capturing on g5, but actually that looks a little bit dangerous to a human. Because that was one of the ideas behind Tal's move queen d3. So he probably thought about preventing this exchange, because this exchange that black has just did. Because after knight takes g5, white's threatening to capture h7, and the only defense would be g6, which is weakening the king side. After that, white can play queen h3, attacking h7, so black must weaken his king side even more. And although the engine says that this position is absolutely equal, of course, for a human, especially against Tal, it looks dangerous to play this position. So it's understandable that for this reason black doesn't capture on a g5. Instead he plays queen d6, moving his queen away from the c file, sooner or later white will play rook c1, and bringing the queen to the defense of the king side. Now Tal exchanges himself. If black recaptures with the queen, white would occupy the open file with a tempo, so Brinck-Claussen captures with the knight instead. Tal still plays rook e1, occupying the open file, putting pressure on the knight and tying the black queen to its defense. That's why knight g6 follows. The knight is eyeing the f4 square, the queen is eyeing this square too, so these pieces might invade it, so g3, the prophylactic move by Tal, and taking these squares under control and completely restricting the knight. Rook e8, black challenges white's rook on the e file, and what should Tal do next? How should he increase the pressure on black's position? He does that by grabbing space on the king side. This knight controls the important e5 square, preventing the white knight from invading it. So Tal pushes the h-pawn forward. He's going to push it to h5, getting some space advantage on the king side, kicking out the knight, and after that his knight can occupy this great central square. And there is nothing black can do about it. He cannot play h5 himself. That would be a mistake because of queen f5, and the h5 pawn would fall. So he plays queen f6 instead, and after h5 the knight retreats to f8. The black rooks are quite active, so Tal exchanges a pair of rooks, and only after that invades the great central square, knight e5. So gradually, step by step, Tal gets some advantage. Queen g5 follows, attacking the h5 pawn. Queen f3, defending the pawn and creating two threats. f7 is under attack, and d5 is also under attack. So by playing queen g5, black didn't just attack the h5 pawn. He also vacated the f6 square for his pawn, because the e5 knight is intolerable, and of course black is going to kick it out with f6. So although the d5 pawn is under attack, black still plays the intended f6, kicking out the knight, parrying the threat of queen takes f7 check, but the d5 pawn is still under attack, and we have reached the first critical position. It's not the main critical position yet, but still the critical position. So what should white do? He can capture on d5, which looks tempting. What can be better than capturing the pawn with a tempo, with a check? So you can pause the video and think, is bishop takes d5 check a good idea or not? And if not, why not? And if it isn't a good idea, what should white do instead? His knight is under attack. So capturing the pawn actually would have been a dubious decision. Let's see why. After bishop takes d5 check, bishop takes d5, queen takes d5 check. Of course, black cannot play king h8. In this case, he loses on the spot after knight f7 check, and after king g8, white doesn't even capture the queen. Instead, he gives checkmate in two moves, knight h6, double discovered check. The only move is king h8 and queen g8 checkmate. So king h8 doesn't work. Knight e6 doesn't work either. In this case, white plays queen d7, attacking the rook. The rook cannot move, it is tied to the defense of the knight. Black cannot defend the rook with the king either. King f8 runs into queen f7 checkmate. The only move for black would be queen takes h5. It seems that black has defended, the rook is defended, but g4 follows, attacking the queen. The knight is defending the pawn. It also controls these squares, so the queen cannot retreat, and that means black is losing. After the queen moves, the rook falls. But instead of king h8 or knight e6, black has a much stronger move, the only move that saves him. He can play rook e6 instead. And it turns out that the knight is under attack. Black is ready to capture it now. The knight is pinned. It cannot move because the queen would be lost. White, however, still has one move, the only move that saves him. He can play queen d8, pinning the f pawn in his turn. So black cannot capture because he loses his queen. But black captures on h5, getting the pawn back, re-establishing the material balance. He's now ready to capture the knight again, so the knight must retreat, and that means white's attack fades away and the position is absolutely equal according to the engine. So white loses his advantage in this case. So for this reason, the obvious move bishop takes d5 check in our critical position doesn't work. That means the knight must retreat. But where? If you hadn't found the best move earlier, I will give you one more chance to pause the video and try to find the best move. And I will give you a small tip this time. Try to find the square on black's territory where the white knight would love to invade. And if you find that square, it would be easier for you to find white's best move. The knight, of course, would love to invade the d6 square, the weakened square, because black doesn't have the dark squared bishop to defend this square anymore. On d6, the knight would attack both the rook and the bishop. But how to invade it? Very easy. Knight c4, right under attack of the pawn. The knight is ready to invade d6. And it turns out that black actually cannot capture it, because white immediately gets the piece back by capturing the light squared bishop, after which the light squares on black's territory are also terribly weakened, and it actually turns out that there is nothing black can do to prevent the catastrophe on the light squares, in particular on this diagonal. White simply threatens to capture on c4 with a check, and after the king moves, queen f7, threatening checkmate, attacking the rook, and there is no way black can defend the c4 pawn. If he plays queen b5, white of course can attack the pawn one more time, or if he plays b5 instead, white has a strong move a4, so b5 will fall, after which c4 will fall too. a6 of course doesn't help because white simply captures the pawn. So, for this reason, after knight c4, as we have just seen, the knight is untouchable, and black must do something about the threat of knight d6, because that would be the double attack. After knight d6, black would be forced to move the rook and defend the bishop, let's say rook e7, after which the knight would capture the bishop, and after rook takes b7, bishop takes d5 check, and the rook on b7 would fall. For this reason, black is forced to defend the d6 square, so he is forced to move his rook away from the open file. Rook d8 follows. And now that the black rook has left the open file, Tal develops his last piece with great effect. Rook e1, occupying the open file and threatening to invade the 7th rank, and the knight is still untouchable for the same reason. The bishop would fall. So, for this reason, black plays bishop c8, unpinning the pawn. Now black is ready to capture the knight, because the bishop on b7 wouldn't be lost. So white doesn't have time to invade the 7th rank, he must save his knight, but Tal moves the knight on a great square, knight e3, from which the knight, together with the queen and the bishop, all attack black's main weakness, the d5 pawn. Bishop e6 for this reason follows, defending the pawn. So the pawn is attacked 3 times and it's defended 3 times. Besides that, by playing bishop e6, black prepares also bishop f7. White also has a weakness, the h5 pawn. So bishop f7 would attack this pawn for the 2nd time. The engine says that in the anticipation of bishop f7, white should play king g2 and respond to bishop f7. Black is ready to capture the pawn with rook h1. But as Tal writes in his annotations, you can actually see his quote on the right side of the screen. Already at this point, he had envisioned the outlines of his fantastic combination. And in order to execute this combination, he needs time. He needs to gain some time. So, for this reason, to gain this time, he sacrifices the h5 pawn instead of defending it as the engine suggests. So, first he activates his rook, so the rook isn't doing anything on the e file anymore because the knight is blocking it. So, it's much more effectively placed on the c file, and it's ready to invade the 7th rank. Bishop f7 follows, attacking the pawn, and what should white do? So now we can see how Tal gains time he needs. The pawn is under attack, but he sacrifices it. h6, threatening to capture on g7, destroying black's king side, so black must do something about it. Of course, capturing with the pawn doesn't make any sense, because black's king side would be demolished, so black captures with the queen. But Tal now achieves what he wanted to achieve. The queen is a little bit out of play now for a moment. From h6, she isn't defending the d5 pawn. So black will be forced, not forced, but most probably, he will need to bring the queen back to g5 in order to defend the pawn. So he will lose time to do all this. At the moment, of course, the pawn is untouchable because the knight cannot actually move because it's pinned. The rook on c1 would fall. So Tal invades the 7th rank. He's down a pawn, but he has the initiative. His pieces are much more active. And he creates two threats now. Besides the obvious rook takes a7, getting back the pawn, he has two main threats. The first one, now that the rook has moved away from c1, the knight is unpinned. Of course, white is ready to capture the pawn. But the second threat is even more serious. White threatens to capture on f7, sacrificing the exchange, and after that, again, as we know, the catastrophe on the light squares would follow. Just to illustrate how dangerous this threat is, let's say if black plays a6, some random move, saving his a-pawn, then after rook takes f7, king takes f7, white is down the exchange, but his attack is simply crushing. Bishop takes d5 check, and now what can black do? King g6 runs into checkmate in 1. Knight e6 runs into bishop takes e6 check, king takes e6, queen c6 check. If now rook d6, then queen e8 with a beautiful checkmate. If king e7, of course, the fork would follow. Black is losing the queen. So the only move would be king f7, but in this case queen c7 check, also attacking the rook. The king must defend the rook, but of course knight f5 again would follow, attacking the queen, threatening checkmate, and there is nothing black can do. He cannot even give a check to save his queen with a tempo because the white queen controls this square. And finally, if instead of king g6 or knight e6, black plays king e8, then the king turns into a target of a terrible attack still, because the queen is out of play, she cannot take part in the defense of the king. The knight is passive too, so after queen e4 check, the king must run away to the queen side, but on the queen side he would be all alone, and let's say in this variation, after bishop b7 check, bishop a8, threatening checkmate on b7, after rook d7, defending against the checkmate, black is losing the knight. Queen check, followed by queen takes f8, and white is winning. So, as we have just seen, the threat of rook takes f7 is really dangerous. Besides that, d5 is also under attack. So, how should black defend against these terrible threats? The engine says that there is only one defense. There is only one move, and not just one move, the whole line that lets black keep the position more or less equal. So he should start with knight e6, attacking the rook. Now, so White doesn't have time to capture on d5 because his rook is under attack. Rook takes f7 doesn't work either because black can play knight g5 with a fork. So most probably after knight e6, white's best move is rook takes a7, getting the sacrificed pawn back, and now black still must play precisely. The obvious knight takes d4 doesn't work. If a knight takes d4, attacking the queen, which looks the natural move, then white simply plays queen d1, attacking the knight, and the d5 pawn falls after the knight retreats. After knight c6, it might seem that white doesn't have time to capture the pawn because the rook is under attack. But it isn't the case. White still captures the knight and he has the initiative, he has the advantage. He is threatening rook c7, for example, attacking the knight, and the knight won't be able to move because of on c6 the knight is defending the d8 rook. But if the knight moves after rook c7, then knight e7 check would follow and the rook would fall. And that's exactly why black cannot actually capture the white rook in this position. After knight takes a7, knight e7 check would follow, followed by queen takes d8 check, and the only move is bishop e8. And do you see a beautiful checkmate? So the king is cut on this diagonal, so white just needs one check. The bishop is also occupying the e8 square, preventing the black king from moving there, so white can move the knight away with a tempo, and no matter how black captures, with the pawn or with the queen, the reply would be the same, queen d6, checkmate. But let's return to this critical position. So the engine says knight e6 is the best move, attacking the rook, and after rook takes a7, we have just seen that knight takes d4, the obvious move, doesn't work, but the engine says that for this reason, instead of this, knight g5 is the only move, attacking the queen and activating the knight. So what should white do now? The position is absolutely equal according to the engine. Let's say if white makes the probably most natural move, so queen g2, for example, so that the queen still keeps attacking the d5 pawn, then black can even try to seize the initiative. It turns out that the pawn is under attack, but black can create his own threats. The first rank is exposed. The white rook is on a7, it isn't defending the first rank. The queen together with the knight are quite active, so black can play rook c8, creating threats of rook c1 check, so white doesn't have time to capture on d5. The knight might invade h3, so all this looks really dangerous. But the position objectively is equal according to the engine. But it's understandable that it was not easy for a human to find this idea with knight e6 and knight g5, so Brinck-Claussen makes the human move, the natural move. d5 is under attack, this is one threat. Rook takes f7 is also threatened, so he brings his queen back to g5. Pairing the first threat, so d5 is now defended, and it also turns out that he has parried the second threat too. Rook takes f7 doesn't work now, because after king takes f7, bishop takes d5 check, black can return the exchange by capturing on d5, and it turns out that white's attack fades away. If he captures with the queen, the queens of course are exchanged and black even gets a big advantage. After knight e6, it turns out that there is no way white can defend the pawn, so black would be simply up a pawn in this knight endgame, and his king is more active, so black is probably winning. And if instead of queen takes d5 check, white captures with the knight, white looks more active, but queen c1 check is possible, and after that black captures on b2. Again, black wins a pawn. These pawns are also weak, so black is better. So for this reason, after queen g5, black's last move, rook takes f7 doesn't work. and d5 is also defended 3 times. So Tal simply captures on a7, getting back the sacrificed pawn. But actually, he didn't just capture this pawn to re-establish the material balance. He has this fantastic combination in mind, and in order for this combination to work, he needs the rook on the a file. So what should black do now? His knight is passive. Obvious knight e6 attacking the pawn doesn't work because the knight would close the bishop's diagonal, and that means this pawn would fall, and white is better. For this reason, instead of knight e6, Brinck-Claussen plays knight g6, activating the knight and probably thinking about knight h4. White won't be able to capture as the g pawn is pinned, and by playing knight h4, black would kick the active queen out of f3, and probably from this diagonal, and after that the pressure on the d5 pawn would be decreased. So we have reached the critical position. Now finally the main critical position. White, of course, can make the prosaic move queen f5, which is the engine's first choice, because this move is simple and it leads to the exchange of the queens, after which the pawn would still remain under pressure, the knight, the bishop would still attack it. That means the black pieces, the bishop and the rook, would be tied to its defense. Besides that, b6 is also weak, white can attack this pawn too. Besides that, white has a chance to create the outside passed pawn on the queen side because he has the pawn majority here. So most probably white is winning after the exchange of the queens. However, Tal didn't go for this position to win in a prosaic way. Instead, he now will execute the brilliant combination he had in mind when, which is amazing, when he sacrificed the h-pawn. Remember when he played h6 to gain time. So you can pause the video now and try to find this fantastic geometrical combination. So it seems that the pawn is defended, so it's attacked 3 times and it's defended 3 times, but Tal still captures it. A brilliant move. The introduction to the combination. Knight takes d5. It might seem that white simply blunders a piece, but it isn't the case. It's true, black cannot capture with the rook. That is losing on the spot. Do you see why? Because the bishop is one of the main defenders of the rook and of the light squares, so white can, as we already know, this move is always dangerous, it's always a threat, sacrifice the exchange, and after king takes f7, the rook falls with a check, and of course this position is absolutely winning for white because he is up a pawn, his bishop is stronger than the knight, in the open position with pawns on both sides of the board. Of course, bishop is stronger, and besides that, of course, the queen is joining the attack. Queen a8 check. Together with the bishop, the queen will create checkmating threats to the black king, and white can combine this attack with the attack on the weak b6 pawn, after which white will have, after the fall of this pawn, white will have connected passed pawn, so this position is easily winning for white. It's clear, but what if instead of rook takes d5, which lets white capture on f7, black captures with the bishop? And what now? Black is up a piece, and white cannot capture on d5. Bishop takes d5 would run into queen takes d5, of course. Black would still remain up a piece, and white's attack would be parried. Besides that, black is threatening to capture on a2 himself. Of course, he isn't threatening to capture the queen, because the bishop is pinned on this diagonal, but he's threatening to capture on a2. So, what did Tal have in mind? If you hadn't found it earlier on the previous move, you can pause the video one more time and try to find Tal's brilliant idea one more time. So now we can see why Tal moved his rook to a7, why he captured the pawn on a7. Not just to get the pawn back, he needed the rook on the a file. So the bishop is pinned, but it's defended by the rook and the queen. So Tal plays rook a8. Right under attack of the rook and the bishop. At first sight it seems like a blunder, but it's a great move. So let's try to understand what's going on. The rook is attacking and pinning the d8 rook. So white's first threat is simply to capture on d8 with a check. Besides that, as the rook is pinned, it isn't actually defending the bishop. That means white is also threatening to capture on d5, so the bishop is also under attack. The black bishop is attacking the three pieces, but it turns out that it cannot capture the queen or the rook. It can capture only on a2. So black actually has only two moves, either bishop takes a2 or rook takes a8. If he captures the rook, so at the moment black has a great material advantage. He's up a rook and a minor piece, but now we can see the geometry, the triangle, this triangle. So in this case, white first gets the minor piece back with a check, and then he captures the rook too. After the exchange of the queens, it doesn't matter, the rook falls anyways. After king f8, bishop takes a8, and this endgame is absolutely winning for white. He's up a pawn. The bishop, as we know, is stronger than the knight. One of his pawns is already passed. He can create the second, a more dangerous outside passed pawn, and it's an easily winning endgame. For this reason, instead of capturing on a8, black captures on a2. But now rook takes d8 check follows. Black cannot reply with knight f8, of course, that runs into queen a8, and there is no way black can defend the knight. So for this reason, king f7 is the only move. And we have reached another critical position. Now we can look at the result of Tal's brilliant combination. Black is actually up material. He has two minor pieces for a rook. But his king is exposed, and his pieces aren't ideally placed to defend him. However, white must conduct his attack precisely. It's easy to make a mistake in this position. So, in fact, there is only one winning move for white, and you can pause the video and try to find it. So, let's say if white makes the first move that comes to mind, which is queen b7 check, it might seem that white is winning, but actually white is losing all of his advantage in this case. After knight e7, it might seem that rook d7, white is dominating the 7th rank, threatening to capture the knight, but black defends the knight with f5, the queen is defending it. So what next? The only way to increase the pressure is by pushing the pawn forward, threatening d6, attacking the pinned knight with the pawn, but it doesn't work, because after queen c1 check, and the queen can give this check, because the c file isn't controlled by the white pieces. After king g2, the queen is activated, queen c5, she's back in the play. She's defending the knight and also attacking the pawn, the d5 pawn. So for this reason, the d5 square too. So for this reason, white cannot actually push the pawn forward because of bishop d5 check, and white is losing the queen. So let's say white might try f3 in order to close this diagonal, but in this case bishop takes d5 is possible, and of course d5 is untouchable because the knight together with the queen defends it. So white can try rook takes e7 check, removing the defender of the bishop, and after queen takes d5 check, the endgame, this queen endgame, is absolutely equal. So it isn't that easy to find the strongest move. Queen b7 check, for example, as we have just seen, doesn't work. So the only move is queen c6 instead. And Tal had to foresee this possibility before he executed his great combination, his geometrical combination. So why this move is so strong? First, it threatens checkmate in 1. And second, it controls the c1 square, preventing the black queen from giving this check. And this is very important, as we have just seen. So to defend against the checkmate in 1, Brinck-Claussen plays knight e7. Tal still gives the check, but now the king at least can escape, king e6. But can we actually call that the escape? The king is right in the center of the board. Black has 2 minor pieces for the rook, but look at his king. Besides that, his pieces, his bishop is almost out of play, his queen isn't active either, and his knight is passive and it's pinned. Rook c8 follows. Tal creates new threats. Rook c6 check is threatened, after which the knight would be lost. Black brings the queen into the defense, queen d5. Also preventing rook c6 check, of course, because the queen would simply capture. But rook c3, creating new threats. Rook e3 check is threatened now, after which the knight again would be lost. That's why queen d7 follows, defending the knight and offering the exchange of the queens. Of course, white should avoid the exchange. If the queens are exchanged, of course, white's attack would fade away and the black would be better. So, rook e3 check follows, king d6, queen b8 check. What now? If queen c7, then of course white simply exchanges the queens and captures the knight. So queen c7 doesn't work. If king d5, then the b6 pawn falls. White, we can even say that now white is up material. Besides that, the black king is right in the center of the board. White's attack, of course, continues. Checkmate in 1 is threatened. Besides that, white gets the connected passed pawns, so he is winning, of course. For this reason, the only move is king c6, defending the b6 pawn. But Tal keeps weaving a mating net around the black king. So the b5 square is accessible for the king, but a4 follows. Now the threat is rook c3 check, after which the king won't be able to move to b5. The only square he would have would be d5, and again, as we know, the b6 pawn after that would fall. That's why knight d5 follows, attacking the rook and taking the c3 square under control, preventing rook c3 check. But rook e1, renewing the threat of this terrible check on the c file. And after this check, the black king wouldn't have a single square to move. That's why queen d6, vacating the d7 square for the king. Rook c1 check anyways follows. And after king d7, queen c8 check. So what should black do now? He has the only move, king e7, but that would run into rook e1 check. Now, if the king moves to f7, he gets checkmated in 1, and what else can black do? He has no other moves. The only thing he can do is to block the check with bishop e6, but the knight doesn't let him do it, so the only move is knight e3, but of course now white is up material, he's up the exchange and a pawn. Besides that, his attack continues. Besides that, the pawns, the kingside pawns, fall too. For this reason, after queen c8 check, Brinck-Claussen resigned. And now I recommend watching either Tal's game against Polugaevsky that we mentioned, or if you watched it last week, a game with even more fantastic geometrical motifs played between Eduard Gufeld and Boris Spassky. But first, I'd be grateful if you like this video, write comments, share and subscribe. as all this is really helpful for the channel growth.